Thank you for participating. I'm David DeWitt, the Director of Commercial and International Programs with Galera. Kelly's already kind of gone into the overview of what I'm going to be discussing, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in. We'll talk about, what we call the unconscious force that can allow us to create poor assumptions and a bias that's known as the narrative fallacy. So what is the narrative fallacy? Well, as humans, it turns out, we can be obsessed to create narratives that don't exist. And this is especially true when, we're looking for narratives that support the outcome that we want to have made available to us. So we tend to go back and construct stories based upon past events. Now, the narrative fallacy was a term coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his book, The Black Swan. It's not a book that's in your library. I really recommend it. It's on the second edition now. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for several years. And it's a wonderful book that identifies multiple fallacies. And the narrative fallacy is just one of the fallacies that we may encounter when we're trying to make this very important decisions for ourselves or for our organization. And he describes the narrative fallacy as it addresses our limited ability to look at a sequence of facts without weaving an explanation into them. So we look at things that happened in the past, maybe even the very near recent past, and we try to create an explanation as to why that happened. And as part of building an explanation, we try to force some type of logical link or relationship between those facts so that we can come up with a narrative. And many times, that narrative is false. So what we're going to talk about today is that when preparing a narrative, an estimate for around price-to-win strategy, that you build an assumption or awareness that the narrative fallacy might be lurking within there, and it can be present and it can be dangerous. So let's talk about this. What is the narrative fallacy? So let's try a real simple example. I do a lot of story point coaching, and I like to use literally puzzles when I'm doing my training classes. And usually what I'll do is I'll show a picture of a puzzle, and I'll ask my students, how long do you think it'll take to build this puzzle? Now, for most of us, we've been playing with puzzles since childhood, and we've formed our own narrative around how you're supposed to you sort all the pieces, you build the frame, you assemble the large parts. We're even teaching our children this process as we go forward. Then we fill in the holes, and invariably, when it takes us forever, and we convince ourselves that there's pieces missing, this all becomes part of our narrative. And the bigger the puzzle, the bigger story we can talk about. How complicated it may have been, or how we conquered that task. And the reality is we all have our own narratives. And as I mentioned, we even start building narratives for our children, even playing with puzzles. So they start to create their own narratives on what they experience. But what happens when we run into the unexpected? So let's assume that, or we always hear this, we build these things all the time. What could possibly go wrong? So in my training class, we'll take a puzzle and we'll use the puzzle, and I make the assumption, I say, let's assume that the customer wants this puzzle done sooner. So instead of us building it for them the way we normally would, building the frame first, etc., what we do is we're going to say, let's do this in Agile, and we're going to do it in sprints. So nothing can go wrong, right? Okay. So the very first thing I do, because it's a story point counting class, I say, I want you to rate the complexity of delivering what the product owner wants in the product owner sequence. This product owner, he wants a lifeguard tower delivered first. Then he wants the blue blanket. And then maybe all the neckerchiefs or the sunglasses or bags and umbrellas and dog's feet. Right away, we realize that our narrative that we've used before is false. That logical story of conclusions of how things should be done based upon things that we've witnessed in the past or been involved in no longer applies. But the funny thing is, and it's not really funny, is that in my training class, guess what? We still trust in our that narrative that we've built for ourselves. So we come in deploying a false narrative for how the puzzle should be solved. And so even though the puzzle's there, they know how it should be delivered, they start looking at the pieces, the eyeglasses, the neckerchiefs, etc. What they do is they take that narrative fallacy, it ends up limiting their ability to relook at a sequence of facts and allow them to come up with a better solution. In fact, they start weaving some explanation into how this work needs to be done. The colors of the neckerchiefs will jump out at us, or The blanket includes all the dog's feet, so we'll be able to get this solved quickly. In all the times I've done this, no one has ever been as efficient as they think they will be. It always ends up taking longer than the assumption, and it's all driven because they won't abandon a narrative fallacy that they brought into the problem-solving activity. So when we talk about the problem narrative fallacy, again, Nassim Taleb, he actually coined the term, and it's a wonderful book. But it was actually Daniel Kahneman I found that really gave me a good answer in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, for how to overcome the narrative fallacy. Now, he calls it an inside view, and excellent description of how he does that. And he says that the way you overcome the inside view is with what he calls an outside view. And I'll be talking about the outside view in a few minutes. But one of the things I noticed when I was putting my slides together is, you ever notice how famous authors always tend to cross their arms? So that must be the thing that you do when you become a famous author. So if you want to be a famous author, you have to cross your arms. But they don't. Famous authors hold their heads. Or do they? When I was building the slides, I was actually creating my own narrative around authors, so to speak. So we all do this, and we're all influenced by how we interpret certain facts and our understanding of what has to go forward. So we weave the narrative into what we think the outcome should be. So what does all this have to do with writing Price to Win or doing Price to Win activities? Well, there was a survey a couple years ago by Ampio Software. They have a really nice website, lots of good information and white papers out there. What they actually found is that very few companies rated their tactical competitive intelligence as good or very good. So in essence, there's a lot of really sneaky data out there, and most companies didn't have access to very good data. And if you don't have access to good data, or it's low quality data, what do you think the remedy for overcoming that is? The reflex is turn to some type of narrative. We actually go out and start looking for those people that have war stories to tell and who can help us figure out what this price to win point is going to be. So who do we usually use for price to win support? Well, a lot of times it's our own existing employees, especially if we're the incumbent. Who knows the job better? We built it before, we can do it again. We know where all the bodies are buried, so we know what mistakes we made, so we know what price point we should probably set this at this time. Or even, we know what efficiencies we can overcome if that is even necessary to reach a certain price point. So we've had that relationship with the customer, so we know what's happened in the past. We know what we have to do going forward. Another group that usually does the price to win support is maybe a consultant that's on loan or retained, or someone that you hire to come in and help you win the work. And a lot of times they actually come from the incumbent because of those reasons up above. Now, these are generally the experts, and they know what it takes to win. They have lots of good stories, right? And, of course, they're always ready to start to work when that RFP comes to fruition and you win the work. Now, there's another group called independent price to win consultants, and they come loaded with just, lots of good data and their processes. They're process folks, and which is wonderful, and they have their good data. But the reality is all these sources have their war stories. And the way you're probably going to select who you're going to use is those who tell the best war story, the ones that have the most believable war story. Now, those war stories may be dead on, or they may be laced with the narrative fallacy. So, but before we go on and I talk too much more about overcoming it, let's just make sure everyone's on the same page for what a price to win is. Okay? So what I'm talking about for a price to win, it's a strategic assessment of what price will win a bid based upon the assessment of the competition, environment, technical excellence, and whatever the government's likely to pay or be willing to pay for the project. So what is that price point that you're looking for? Okay? So the price to win is not a life cycle cost estimate. Some RFPs, they want maintenance costs thrown in there, which is fine. Price to win is not a proposal pricing exercise. Usually that's part of the activity that's going on, but that's not what the price to win is. And price to win is not an engineering build-up estimate. Okay. However, all these little knots can actually be part of the price to win activities. So what we're really doing at the price to win is we want to know what's the number that we need to come up with that's our win point so that we can decide if we want to even bid on the proposal or we have as our target pricing activity. Okay, so now that we're on the same page there, how does the narrative fallacy actually impact these price-to-win activities? So I've talked already a little bit about what the narrative fallacy is, and I gave you kind of an example of how people get ingrained in their way of doing things and going forward. But what I want to do now is borrow some slides. I want to borrow some slides from a presentation from Bob Hunt, Tom Sanders, and John Kilgore. This was a excellent presentation they did. It's available on our website, and you can email Kelly to get this information, ktimco@gallery.com. But I'm going to use some of their slides going forward. So one of their slides here is the 4 steps of a price-to-win analysis. So these would be the strategic steps that you would take if you want to do, or that you would perform during your analysis. Okay? Know what the client wants, know what the government client can afford, know what the competition will likely bid, and assess your client's bids. The question is, how do you go in and actually do these things? So you're going to try and find people who are going to help you understand how to drive these steps and understand how to solve the problem. But the real question is, what's the story that motivates the actors that are going to be performing the steps above? You know, we tend to try to identify the folks that can help us with this, but what is their backstory and what are they bringing on board or bringing to solve the solution? Okay. So the reality is that the narrative fallacy can actually influence each one of these steps. Okay. Nothing is really immune. So let's take a look at one of their slides from the price to win from a cost estimator perspective. They say you need to balance the wants and the costs. So they say a subtle and particularly troublesome problem, especially in high-tech technology projects, is the lack of balance between a customer's perceived value as it relates to the importance of a desire for design features and the cost of these features. So we're talking about a customer's perceived value, importance, desire. These types of factors are very highly susceptible to the narrative fallacy. When we have to try and answer these questions, that's when the estimation bias starts to creep in. And if we look down at the next bullet, we can kind of see a consequence. This problem is quite common. It can be a result of risky, volatile project that has a high probability of failure. This narrative fallacy isn't just the people doing the price to win work, the ones that actually win the work. It can also be within the customer themselves. They have a narrative of what they think is going to happen on a project. And these failures are actually a consequence of the narrative fallacy getting in and disrupting what actually should have been done a little more scientifically, I would say. Okay. One more slide here from the Price to Win presentation. It says, a price to win includes an analysis of the requirements as defined in the RFP. Now, we all know requirements are unambiguous, right? I wish that was true. But unfortunately, this ambiguity is what we often temper by using narratives. We come up with our own narrative around why that requirement's there, what the relevance of it's going to be, and how to provide a remedy for that requirement. Next bullet, an assessment of what the purchasing agency or the government is willing to pay. The question is, that assessment, is that based on data or is it based on a narrative? Did you go back and actually dig into the background of the agency's historical trend is for pricing? Most of us usually do this, but we have to be careful if we're using data to help us with that assumption or that assessment. The next bullet, an assessment of who the competitors are and what they are likely to bid and best to win. Okay. So who is our competition? Who do we have to see as our main threat? The question is, does our narrative speculate the threats? Do we go back and look at past examples and we say, this company X, they never bid on projects of this size, so they're not going to do this project here. However, they did just recently jump into a project of similar nature. So we start doing all this narrative building, and we allow this bias to start creeping into what we think is going to be happening from our competition. In the last bullet here, we talk about the need for an independent assessment of the client's internal proposal in the form of red team, independent estimates, or even a thorough BOE assessment. This last bullet is what Kahneman would call using an outside view. This is what you will do to try to remedy the narrative or how to temper that narrative. You want to have some other way externally of challenging the bias that may have creeped in to your underlying assumptions and the resolution of the solution that you're going to propose. So you might, David, this is all common sense. We know that people have biases and we mitigate it. But the reality is, and that's really kind of the irony, it's all hindsight, right? Hindsight is that post hoc rationalization where the stories and legends are born. It's through the hindsight that we develop these narrative fallacies. So we want to go back and look at what Taleb says. He describes how that narrative fallacy actually is given life. And he says, explanations bind facts together. They make them all more easily remembered. So we take these facts, we bind them together, and we try to create some relationship between them so that we can tell a story. In other words, we try to help them make more sense. We build it into a story, a narrative. Okay. Where there is a propensity can go wrong is when it increases our impression of understanding. So someone tells us the story from a narrative they built, and it's very believable, even though it may be built on a bunch of inconclusive or incorrect assumptions or facts. Okay. So if you understand now, a narrative fallacy, it's not something that gets constructed during the price to win activity. It's something that gets carried into the room with you. So something to think about, the better the war story, the more likely some facts were misremembered. Okay. So what can we do to minimize it, the impact of this estimation bias or this narrative fallacy? Well, we saw that answer several slides ago. Best thing to do is perform some type of independent assessment of the client's internal proposal. This information comes from that slide deck I was talking about from Bob Hunt and his team, red team reviews, etc. But all the participants need to be aware of an inherent bias that they are potentially carrying into the room. It's really good that you're doing these things as you're building it, but even when you're doing the assessment of the estimate, you need to be aware that you may have an estimation bias. Okay? So all assumptions without basis of hard facts, while I said should be discounted, they should at least be minimized for their influence until you can go back and substantiate the assumption. Okay? So anytime there's little data, you need to dig harder or remove that assumption. The question is, how do we kind of turn off all those stories that we've learned? And it's really hard to do because we're wired this way. It's not bad what we do. It's just that's the way we do things. It's human nature. But really the only way to overcome bias is with data. All price to win artifacts should be challenged as either an assumption or a fact by the reviewer. So when you're looking at, when you're laying out your price to win and the different sections, whether the technical volumes, whatever it may be, whatever volume you're working with, and someone comes to a conclusion that you can get to X because of Y, challenge that assumption, rate it. Is this an assumption or is it a fact? If it's an assumption, it should be tossed out or pushed back on for more data. Get that assumption qualified. If it's marked as a fact, you should actually be able to go back and grab a data point to validate it. And ultimately, this becomes part of your basis of estimate. Lots of good data sources out there. The federal marketing sources, FedBizOps, doing FOIA requests, NDIA events. They're great sources for facts, but I encourage you to sift through them to make sure that they don't have their own biases, as well as the PEO briefings that they hold. It's a wealth of useful data, but you have to be careful when they start qualifying their answers, because that qualification tends to become from some type of narrative or hesitancy to fall back on data that maybe isn't available. Okay? So this really kind of begs the question, what do you do about missing data? And the answer is that much of that data can be generated using models. You all knew where I was going here. So another slide from the presentation, Price to Win, a cost estimator's perspective, is that Seer actually helps fight off the fallacy. So if you don't have data, what we say is one of the benefits of Seer tool is our ability to capture what you know and model what you don't know. And then the 4 bullets there from their presentation of what you need to do. Build that integrated cost assessment. Create an independent cost assessment, a model using little or no customer data. This is really critical, especially when you want to use the Seer models to give you an industry relevant estimate. Then you want to compare it to what you think your price to win team is doing going forward. So why are they making those assumptions when this is what the industry average might be? Okay. They also help you understand what a likely competitor pricing might be based upon building a model around work that they've done previously using that research data that you go out and collect. And then lastly, you're going to want to perform an after bid assessment. So you put your bid together, you're ready to roll it out there, or maybe you've even won the work. You probably want to build a model and say, what risks are inherent within this activity that we've just started, because the model, again, is going to help you overcome internal biases by giving you that outside view. Okay, so at the bare bones of everything, Seer tools they're math models. So what I'm encouraging you to do is let the science of the parametrics mitigate that influence of the war stories and the narrative fallacy. Okay? I like that quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson. He says, "The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe it." And so many times when I'm building models with customers, the first thing they say is, "I don't believe it." When then I challenge them with their assumptions, and all the assumptions are true, well, the likeliness is that the model's pretty close to being correct based upon those assumptions. So get science in the loop where you can, so that you can do what Kahneman recommends by deploying an outside view. Okay. So in kind of closing, what I want to do is I'm going to talk about another narrative fallacy, and this is the old, everyone's probably heard the term, let them eat cake. Well, the story goes that when the French poor were starving, Marie Antoinette, said, let them all eat cake. And what happened was she became a symbol of that decadence, and it literally fueled a revolution. And it wasn't too long, a few years later, she literally was dragged off to the guillotine and she lost her head. Okay. This is a narrative fallacy of the worst kind. The reality is she actually never said it. It was likely said by Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he was describing Marie-Thérèse. Marie Antoinette was only 10 years old at the time. But the narrative was created such that it was carried over to her, and as a consequence, she lost her head. So my recommendation is, beware of that narrative fallacy. You don't want to lose your head. And my other point would be is to challenge yourself. Are you bringing a bias into the room with you? Hopefully you've enjoyed this very quick discussion on narrative fallacy, and I'll go ahead and open to any questions.